trainees and faculty to local experts so that formal communication and collaboration could start as soon as tomorrow morning. I'll just give a brief introduction. It's my pleasure to welcome Jacob Ballon. So I've known Jake since he was a chief resident at Stanford. He and I sort of share a passion for early intervention and improving health services for adolescents and young adults. I'll let him tell you about his program. Just a quick summary. So after finishing his training at Stanford, he went on to Columbia to finish a couple-year fellowship in schizophrenia research, and then came right back to the Bay Area and founded the Inspire Clinic. That was about 5 years ago. And I'll let him tell you all about Inspire, and let's welcome Jake.
All right. Well, thank you, Damien. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm happy to talk about the Inspire Clinic at length, and so this is a great opportunity for me to do just that. So Damien and I actually met for real when I was chief resident, but we met virtually actually while working on this website far longer ago. And I thought, well, why not go through the Internet Wayback Machine and just sort of find out some of the things that we were working on. And frankly, last night I nearly changed my entire talk to go down the rabbit's hole, which was all the news articles that we had posted in 1998. But this is the homepage for schizophrenia.com, where Damien and I both volunteered kind of calling articles from the news media. Frankly, most of them, it turns out, were press releases, I think. I don't know that either of us were quite aware of what all we were totally putting up on there, but that's because we were much younger and more naive at that point. But I thought it would be fun just to look and see. These were some of the articles that came out. It's hard to read all of them, but it's interesting that these are from 20 years ago. And I dare say that if you were to take a smattering of these articles, they could be, frankly, a lot of the same articles that would be published today. So there's something about TMS on here. There's something about CBT for psychosis on here. There's a couple of very interesting press releases relating to drugs that I just won't mention because I said I wouldn't talk about things like that in my talk today. But it's just interesting. I went down quite a rabbit's hole last night, let's just say, looking at all these. Second announcement for today is that today's election day. So you can register to vote still in California, right? Same day registration is a thing. And just, to know that Proposition 2 has mental health implications, right? So something that those of us in this room in particular should be taking some leadership in thinking about. So moving on. Disclosures. We do some studies that are funded indirectly or directly from Otsuka, Janssen, Alkermes, and Pear Therapeutics, as well as NIMH studies, and then I've done a little bit of consulting for these two companies. All right, so just as a matter of orientation, this is the view from my office. Actually, not quite. You have to take a left past the construction, but then you can see this. But I realize, I have only come to UCSF a handful of times, frankly, since I've been back at Stanford, and so maybe, you all haven't quite come down to see the farm. We have the big game coming up on Saturday, and so I guess some people still watch football. This is where the Inspire Clinic works. I want to focus the talk today on three areas. Talk a little bit about what we do clinically in the Inspire Clinic, who we see, how they come in, just a little bit about what that's like, because I know I get questions not infrequently from folks wanting to refer people, so in the spirit of clinical collaboration, I'll talk a bit about that. I'll talk a little bit also about the research that we're doing, particularly the non-industry sponsored research, and a little bit about how, as a group, we're trying to conceptualize work in psychosis. And then we'll end with some of the things that we're hoping to do in the future. Many of those things could involve, or should involve, or will involve people in this room. So this is our sort of vision and mission that we put together that we have amended over time, but we're interested in the Inspire Clinic, frankly, many ways in emulating what's already done in the PATH Clinic here at UCSF. And in fact, when we started the clinic, some of our faculty had spent time working with the early psychosis folks here, including Damien and Rachel and Dan, and we wanted to really create something that felt that matched a lot of that community and team-based spirit. We want to make sure that we're thinking about recovery-oriented care. We want to make sure that we're focusing on using that kind of language with folks, and that we're helping to instill that kind of language and optimism into the community. And we want to make sure that we are hitting the various disciplines that are expected in the Stanford Department of Psychiatry in terms of leading in clinical work, leading in research, and in community partnerships. This is actually an old slide that I dug up because I had actually forgotten what the name Inspire initially stood for, because it was at one point an acronym, and I was glad to find this old slide, actually. But why did we call it the Inspire Clinic? Well, we wanted to make sure that we were giving people a message of optimism in the name of our clinic. We wanted people who were struggling, who were scared, who were experiencing psychosis for the first time, and the family members of those folks to know that they were coming to a place where we didn't think they were walking in with a death sentence, but actually they were walking in to a place where we could help them and we could make a difference in their life. We felt like the name Inspire connoted that recovery-oriented mindset, and that actually we would be inspired by the folks who come into the clinic, and hopefully they would be inspired by us in a real reciprocal kind of way, and that's certainly what has happened. These on the bottom are some of the words that the I and R and E that were there. Frankly, one of the reasons we dropped the acronym, besides the fact that it was really too long and a mouthful, was that we couldn't fully agree on what the P should be for, which is, I think, common in a lot of early psychosis clinics. So we just decided that we would leave it as Inspire or Inspire Clinic and go from there. This is what we have in the clinic. So we have, obviously, I'm the psychiatrist within the clinic, and we have a couple of other MDs who help with doing prescriptions, although, frankly, the role of the psychiatrist in the clinic is not just the prescriber. It's certainly, this is a full team. We're all trying to work on working together and imbuing each other's work with the different disciplines that we bring. We have several psychologists. Kate Hardy is our lead psychologist, who spent some time here working before coming to Stanford. And so we offer individual and group CBT for psychosis. We're expanding our groups actually to include both, right now we have a first episode group, as well as we're setting up something for people who are a little more chronic. We have a full-time social worker, and then we have a whole smattering of trainees and research staff. We really do our best never to turn away a trainee who's interested in psychosis and working with this population. We have two components to our clinic. Some of this I won't get into that much detail because it gets into the weeds of the Stanford versus Lucille Packard hospital systems, which are two separate systems. It is our long-standing goal to make this transitional age youth program traverse these two systems more seamlessly, but that is a tough order. So we have two sides of the clinic. Steve Adelsheim is a child psychiatrist who runs and is the director of the child side of the clinic, where they'll see people generally 12 years and older, occasionally somebody a little bit younger if there's a real pressing need for that. They're really focusing more on first episode and then ultra high risk. So they take on more of the folks who haven't, let's say, fully declared themselves as having a psychotic illness. We can talk a little bit more about what that means. But they're taking in people for whom there's still a lot of diagnostic questions, many of which, frankly, aren't going to get answered quickly. On the adult side, we can see people 16 and up, so you can see that there is some overlap, particularly if somebody has really crossed the threshold into what we would decide as a psychotic illness. They're more likely to come directly into the adult side because we're expecting that we'll take care of them for longer. And so we focus a bit more on the first episode, although as the main psychosis clinic at Stanford, we will see people of any age group or any age or chronicity, ultimately. One of the limitations also we have is that we only take private insurance or Medicare, so just as far as referrals are concerned, to keeping that in mind. And our demographics basically reflect the community around us, and about a little more than half of our patients, I would say, are in the early psychosis phase. As far as what happens when a person is referred to the clinic, we try to make sure that everybody coming into the clinic is seeing all of the different disciplines that we represent, at least directly. We may refer people also to see other different disciplines like nutrition or occupational therapy and things like that as needed. But everybody starts out generally seeing the psychiatrist and doing the sort of formal intake, making sure that there is appropriateness for the clinic diagnostically and things like that. And then we have they'll have a social work visit to fill in some of the gaps in terms of their what's going on at home, what are they interested in, what are some of the things that we can do to help make sure we're reaching them appropriately. We can do that either in the clinic or we can have we do home visits now, and then they also will see the psychologist who will assess for aspects of trauma in particular and things that may inform how we want to formalize the care and think about, sort of what is the formulation, how we're putting this whole picture together. Also assess for whether the person is interested and appropriate for participating in some of the CBT that we offer. And then after the patient's met with the whole members of the team, then we'll have a meeting where we discuss the treatment plan. We'll present that to the patient to think about as well. And then we also offer 3 sessions of psychoeducation to parents or family members when they come in. Because this is a first episode clinic primarily, many people are adjusting to the language, to the expectations. They can carry with them a whole host of preconceived ideas as to how this is going to go, how it should go, and sometimes those ideas are concurrent with ours. Sometimes I feel like there's things we can do to help people feel a little bit more comfortable. We take referrals from all over. I did want to mention, I know we have people who come from, as far north as Humboldt County, as far south as San Luis Obispo. That's just the nature, I think, of Stanford. It's, I'm sure, similar here in many ways. We get a number of referrals for second opinions as well, and this is certainly one area where I have sent people here for second opinions and received them, and it really works out quite well to get that second set of eyes, because a lot of times these are not clear-cut cases. In particular, we get a number of people with treatment resistance, and that could be a whole discussion in and of itself, what that means. But we do a lot of partnering with folks around the medical center, particularly in immunology and in other areas, looking at perhaps are there reversible or at least better ways to understand the physiology of what's going on with somebody who's presenting with psychosis, especially when it doesn't respond to conventional medications and things, and it seems as though maybe we need to really rethink and reopen the diagnosis. And we've had a few very interesting successes in that regard too, for finding that adding another antipsychotic really wasn't the way to go, and I'm happy to talk about those at some point as well. So with that, I will transition over to talking a little bit more about some of the research that we do. We do, a little smattering of industry-funded research. I'm going to hold off on talking about that primarily because it's not, I don't think it's as interesting to talk about right now as the more investigator-initiated things that we have going on. In general, we have areas. The main areas of activity right now involve looking at aspects of metabolism, which I'll talk about in a minute, the impact of exercise on things, and of course there's interrelatedness between exercise and metabolism, and then we do a number of community engagement projects as well. So, as a group, stepping back, as we're thinking about what is it that we want to accomplish in our research objectives, part of what is inherently challenging is understanding, well, what are we looking for, and what are we expecting, and we've had many conversations about, well, what does it even mean to be looking for sort of schizophrenia pathology, right? I mean, there's an inherent singularity to this as a one word, one entity thing, and so one of the things we're trying to do is to really think about how can we think in sort of more broad terms about what is it that people are experiencing, and what are the overlaps in other areas. So does that mean looking through the genetic findings, things like that, understanding changes that may be inherently different in many people with schizophrenia, metabolically, cardiovascular. Certainly there's the immune system and a microbial system, a microbiome are all hot topics these days. So, we want to understand, what is it that we can do perhaps to either prevent or change the course of things? How can we help? What can we do to help alter the trajectory for folks? Because the truth is that it is, in spite of all of the optimism that we want to have for folks and our excitement about what we can do for early psychosis work and interdisciplinary work and really trying to help people stay on their trajectory, there still is it can still be quite a devastating disease for many people. And so what can we do to help keep people on their trajectories? Are there interventions that we should be considering? How can we really leverage some of the power of our computing to think about understanding heterogeneity and understanding what are some of the risks and things like that on a more individual basis. And so ultimately, one of the things we have recently started is a working group, which is called the Schizophrenia Working Group for now, although I'm actually hoping that we'll change that title over time as we start to recognize that complexity. But to use folks from around the campus to come up with ways to bring our large data sets that are out there together. Ultimately, this came from we were applying for an internal grant at Stanford. We didn't get it, but it turns out, right, sometimes just applying for the grant can be the impetus for really getting some good work together. And led by a number of faculty members from outside of the department, actually, I was brought in with others from psychiatry to begin thinking about, well, how could we work the maze backwards, perhaps, right? What are some of the things that we know that maybe are there that are more easy to understand than complex brain tissue and things like that? And so how can we use big data, artificial intelligence, design thinking, all the different omics, bringing that expertise together. What I like about this group also is that we started out actually with clinical as the mindset, and so our first team meeting together as we were beginning to think about this was actually where we brought in a patient, and many of the folks who spent a lot of time doing a lot of really hard science had never interacted with somebody who had experienced psychosis before, and it helped to add some clarity to what was the mission that we were trying to achieve by bringing this group together. And that's important because it's easy to get into the weeds and to, again, without understanding the varying course that people with schizophrenia can have, it's easy to start thinking about this as, well, it's this gene, or it's this group of genes, or, if we only could just alter the microbiome, then I think we would have the answer. And that's the struggle, is that there isn't going to likely be an answer for for all people, right? But what I'm hopeful with this group is that we can start using some of the big data to begin parsing apart at least a few different pathways along the lines, and so that might help us understand at least what some people are experiencing, and then maybe we can start adding different groups and be able to understand the background a little bit better. Also included in this is that Kate is part of this, and which adds a different dimension as well, making sure that we are not reducing schizophrenia down to biological underpinnings, and in fact that there's a lot psychological which intersects with the biology and in different ways. And so anyway, it's a dynamic group. I would invite folks who are interested in that to reach out to us, because we're sort of in rapid expansion mode and trying to think about, well, what is it that how are we going to keep this group together and work on putting in some real concrete projects. So I just wanted to show a little bit of data from a couple of the things that we've done, as well as, again, talk about some of our ongoing projects. And so so as we are, again, trying to figure out how to work that maze backwards, so to speak, it's helpful to think about, well, what are some of the genetic findings? And so we are at the point now where I think it's fair to say that the candidate gene studies have been helpful, but it's, we're moving beyond that into larger data sets. And so Laramie Duncan is a geneticist on faculty she's just started with us, and she has expertise in crunching large GWAS studies together and actually bringing the different data sets together, and put together this slide on correlations. And what's interesting about this is a number of different things, right? So up here, you can see that this is the genetic correlation between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And recognizing that there's probably diagnostic imprecision, let's say, in some of these large data sets and whatnot, it's still interesting to see how much the genetic risk for schizophrenia correlates with the genetic risk for bipolar disorder. So as the bars go further this way, this is a... If you're going to take all of the genes and sort of throw them all into there, not any individual gene or anything like that, but just all the genetic information, what is the correlation? And so you can see that it's quite high here. But then there's some interesting other findings, frankly, one of which was this citrate finding here. So people at genetic risk for schizophrenia are at a genetic risk for sort of lower citrate levels, and I don't know what that means just yet, but one can step back and think about, well, there certainly are a number of people with mitochondrial issues and things, and so what sort of metabolic relationship is there here? I'm sure someone here could draw the citric acid cycle and figure out sort of where things are. I can no longer do that, but anyway, it's an interesting thing to consider. Well, these look like small effect sizes, but given the sort of size of the data and what we're talking about as far as, in general, polygene interactions that are very, very small, to get an effect size like that is notable. The other thing I would point out down here that I was surprised and actually was needed to look, we double and triple check to make sure this wasn't even about a coding error or something like that, was that in fact people with genetic risk for schizophrenia show a genetic risk for being slightly underweight. And I thought that was interesting because I think about people with schizophrenia as being generally overweight. And it was interesting to go back to some of the old literature and epidemiological literature to find out that in fact often there is, people are slightly underweight at the time of first presentation, first diagnosis. And it's unclear exactly why that would be. They are at risk, which we'll talk about in a minute, for having some insulin resistance, and that could perhaps correlate a little bit with that. But it's unclear. But nonetheless, it was interesting to see that I had to eat crow on that one, because I was certain that this was actually incorrect. And then turned out that it was a again, it's a much smaller effect size, but again notable, and worth thinking about again also as we think about the power of these medications to really change people's metabolism very quickly. So one of the things that I also think is important is that we think about schizophrenia as a whole body disorder, or psychosis as a whole body disorder, and much of that we're still really learning about. But there's all kinds of areas where dopamine and dopamine signaling can interact with different tissues in the body to cause different things. And I'll talk in a minute a little more detail about the pancreas, which is the one that I feel like is sort of the most relevant in this. But certainly we know that there are aspects of hepatic glucose production, and we know that using metformin, for example, can help with some kind of antipsychotic-induced weight gain in some people. And there's just a number of different areas within the body that can that are pro-inflammatory. So whether it's fat or abdominal obesity, things like that interact with what we know or what we think we know, or the parts that we have an idea about when it comes to understanding schizophrenia. And there's the pancreas. In particular, the pancreas is of greater interest in some regards because the pancreas is actually very sensitive to dopamine. L-DOPA will trigger hyperglycemia. We know that there are D2 receptors in the pancreas that don't exist really that elsewhere in the body, and that if you block those D2 receptors, it leads to a cascading of events that releases insulin. And so it's interesting to think about, well, what does that mean? I mean, first of all, antipsychotic medications can cause insulin resistance at any dose. They can cause weight gain at any dose, and it's not dose dependent. So could it be that in fact it's incredibly sensitive in the pancreas, and that's part of the reason that even at microdoses of antipsychotics, that's where we're actually experiencing some of the metabolic changes. Also, it's the reason that if there are dopamine receptor abnormalities or differences in people with schizophrenia, that could also be the case in the pancreas. Again, it can be easier in some ways to study the pancreas than to study the brain, and so this is an area where we're interested in trying to understand, well, what's really going on here, and how do these feedback? Also, what is the central versus peripheral impact of antipsychotics on satiety, on insulin resistance? How do these things go together? Because it does seem that antipsychotics make people hungrier, but we don't really have a great answer as to why exactly that is. And so you would think by now we'd have a better idea, because this has been a phenomenon we've been looking at since the schizophrenia.com slides in the 90s, and even to some extent before that. But it's unclear. So we're interested in trying to figure out a little bit about that, and so we devised a clinical trial that we're just about to start recruiting for, which is actually to look at using a dopamine agonist. We chose bromocriptine because bromocriptine actually has an FDA indication for type 2 diabetes, it turns out, working through circadian rhythms, but working through dopamine and dopamine's influence on circadian rhythms. It turns out that it can be effective in type 2 diabetes. We thought, well, okay, that makes some sense. Also, maybe that is a way of unifying antipsychotics. We looked in the older literature and found that bromocriptine had been studied for use as it is still sometimes used for prolactinemia, as well as for tardive dyskinesia and other side effects of antipsychotics, where it wasn't particularly effective. But in those studies, there wasn't any data collected on any of the metabolic markers and things. And so we're going to get started on this. Also, it was shown, the studies didn't also show, albeit they were small, that there was any necessary increased risk in psychosis, which for the folks who this will be an add-on medication to people who will be taking antipsychotics, was interesting, and Obviously, that would be a concern because bromocriptine unopposed by an antipsychotic does have a risk for psychosis, and so we wouldn't want to take that on. But it did seem to be relatively safe, and actually there's some literature that shows that it might even be, again, in some small studies and case series from a long time ago, helpful for negative symptoms. So it'd be interesting to see if there are a couple of areas for wins. Ultimately, this study is interesting, but I would be more interested in trying to figure out what we can do to think about isolating the effect on the pancreas. So are there ways that we could actually keep a dopamine agonist that's peripherally limited and really separate that out, both from a research question perspective, but also maybe that would help give a bit more of that push in the pancreas to stave off the insulin resistance that is likely to occur. Because if you're increasing insulin production by blocking it with dopamine, and there's no sugar involved, then the insulin is by definition going to be less sensitive. And so, what can we do to interfere there a little bit, and maybe without having that risk of dopamine agonism in the brain that would conceivably cause some people to have an exacerbation psychotically? So that's more or less where we are with some of our metabolic research right now. And then I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about what we're doing in exercise. Doug Nordsey, who was with us for the last 3 years and just returned back to Dartmouth, was really leading the way in large parts on thinking about exercise, and he spent a lot of time thinking about lifestyle psychiatry. But it's clear that there are aspects of exercise that we need to be taking advantage of within psychiatry writ large. Certainly, and so BrainX is, I'll just mention briefly, is a similar working group that came out of that same grant mechanism that the Schizophrenia working group came from. Also was equally successful in its pursuit of the actual grant, but left us with again, a number of people from around the university who are interested in understanding exercise and thinking about what is, how can we really best utilize exercise? What is it about exercise that's helpful? Is it aerobic exercise in particular, or are there other types of exercise that are worthwhile? What can we understand? Because exercise itself is really, easy to administer treatment if you can get people in to do it. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well. We also have a study called ICE, which I'll present, which wasn't as controversial in name when we named it as it is maybe now. And then we did a survey of many of the folks in our clinic and found some interesting results, at least within our small cohort. So the ICE study is improving cognition through exercise in schizophrenia. It's a study that I did as a pilot with David Kimmey, who's now at Mount Sinai. He and I did that together when we were at Columbia. And the idea is that we know that people with schizophrenia overall tend to be more sedentary. And I think we could, again, spend a lot of time thinking about culturally and how we've gotten to there, and what the messaging we give to people about being sedentary is, I think, in many ways actually similar to the messaging we used to get people about smoking, which is that we tolerate it in a way that I think if we really were thinking holistically, medically, we wouldn't tolerate the sedentary lifestyle as much. But it is the case that many folks are going to be staying at home and not doing much. And we know that has impacts neurocognitively. And we also know that people who in general, we know that there's neurocognitive deficits in schizophrenia, and that people who are less active also have some deficits. And we know that aerobic exercise can improve both. The thought is that maybe it acts through BANF as a mediator, and so that's one of the things we are going to be looking at in this study. But either way, we know that can be helpful. Now, when we did the pilot study, anytime I told people about how this study would go, they would have the same reaction. Well, how are you ever going to get people to actually show up for the research and to do it? And so what we were doing in this study, in the pilot study, was 3 days a week of aerobic exercise for an hour compared with treatment as usual, right? So how did we get people to come in, and would they even come in? Like, what's the point? And yet, I like to show this slide because we actually had incredible adherence to the protocol. And Hurricane Sandy and Christmas were kind of the biggest reasons people didn't come. But it's amazing to think that 80% of people were there, and 4.8 miles doesn't sound very far, but in Manhattan miles, that is pretty far. And people were coming, an hour plus on the subway each way to come to these. And I think there's a number of reasons why this is important. One is it shows that it's possible. I think you can say, well, these are a self-selected group. No one was forced to do the research. Obviously, people who signed up were people who were more motivated, so that's fine. But also, what I observed in going to some of these exercise groups was the camaraderie that I think many of us who have done group exercise programs have experienced, which is that they were beholden to one another, and so there was, if somebody didn't show up one day, well, the other people in the group were going to ask them. And I think it's easy to assume that people with schizophrenia aren't going to kind of pay attention to the other members of their group. The exercise was generally done in groups of 2 or 3 people. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. And it helped that we had a trainer who was engaging with people, but he wasn't, let's say, the most engaging trainer. In fact, when he left the study and I became the trainer, we knew for a fact that it wasn't about, being, motivated by like a young and hip, whatever kind of guy. And so, there was something about it that kept people coming, right? And so I'll be curious. So now we're doing the follow-up study, so I'll be interested in how that goes. But here's some of the data again from the pilot that is basing this current study we're doing on, which is that you can see again that the exercisers compared to the treatment as usual had notably increased aerobic fitness, and along with that their matrix scores, the cognitive battery that we typically use in schizophrenia research, also improved. And so that there was a nice correlation there. You can see as well that the exercises really did improve in their cognition. This is over 12 weeks. Now, there's a lot to think about. How do you maintain that? What are the implications? But I want to hold that there for a minute and think about it as we get into talk a little bit about the current version of the study, but then also the survey that we took and some of what we found amongst our exercisers, the people who are inherent exercisers as well. But again, just to think about all the advantages of exercise, right? That, people feel good about doing it. It's not stigmatizing. It's the thing that everybody should be doing in general. We should really have, exercise studios, frankly, in all of our health facilities, but in particular in the psychiatry clinic. And I think that'll be made even more clear when I show some of the results from our survey. So we're enrolling folks now. The replication study is over 4 sites. We're trying to get 200 folks. The pilot study had about 30 subjects. Instead of a treatment as usual control group, we're doing stretching and toning. And so we're telling folks that they'll be assigned to 1 of 2 different types of exercise, so we're not trying to predispose people to knowing that they're in the control or the active group. But we are particularly interested in exercise aerobic group. We have folks where they wear straps so we can make sure we're monitoring very closely their heart rate to make sure that the aerobic group is achieving close or at their target heart rate, and the stretching and toning group is actually not doing that, although that can be challenging. Many of the folks who are not in great shape, even when doing simple stretching and toning, will raise their heart rates up pretty significantly, although it's interesting to see how over the course of a couple of weeks that really actually comes down pretty quickly. Again, it's with a trainer. It's 3 times a week for an hour, and it's been really great. I've noticed even in just a couple of the subjects I've had, irrespective of which group they are, as they're coming in for more of the research, the phone calls that I'm getting in the clinic are just decreasing. That their general sort of subjective feelings of wellness are increasing, and it's interesting. So Doug, working with one of our Palo Alto University psychology students on a dissertation, embarked on a survey of many, but not all, of our clinics. So this is looking at 41 people who answered the survey, which is probably about a half or so of people in the clinic. So it's not a bad sample, maybe a little under half. And asked them, do you exercise? Are you an exerciser? And about 2/3 of our clinic said that they actually did exercise, as defined by 30 minutes, 3 times a week. And that, first of all, I was surprised by, and I recognize that to some extent we do have a little bit of a rarefied clinical population. Again, based on the fact that we take private insurance, we have a younger population, we have people who are primarily living at home with parents who are often kicking them out to do certain things. But even in spite of all of those things, 68% of people said that they exercised at least 30 minutes 3 times a week. I thought that was impressive. Running and resistance training were the most popular. But this is where I thought it got really interesting. So we had exercisers rate how they felt pre and post exercise, and with the non-exercisers were primarily, not exclusively, but primarily gamers. A few people identified watching television as a way that they spent a lot of their time. But many of the people who didn't exercise said they didn't exercise because they were playing, immersive video games, World of Warcraft and the like. for many hours a day. And so it was interesting to hear what were some, thinking about it from a motivational interviewing perspective, thinking about it in general. People who are doing that must be getting something for it, right? Nobody's sitting and looking at a video game for 8 hours, 10, 14 hours a day if they're not getting something for it. And it can be hard to articulate sometimes exactly what that is. And so we did a variety of self-report and other measures to look at a variety of domains. And couple of things that came out was people, when they are gaming or when they're exercising, both found that they had improvements in their negative symptoms. They felt more engaged in certain things. They felt that they had more control over some of their positive symptoms and really kind of cognitive control. And I think that's important to recognize that, again, one of the things that's helpful and that we encourage a lot clinically is behavioral activation and getting people out and about, being active, looking for supported employment or other kinds of work. And one of the reasons that's the case is that when people are more actively engaged in activities, they tend to not be as actively engaged in their psychosis for many folks. And there's plenty of data to show that people who are actively engaged in those kinds of activities tend to do better. But it was nice. It was interesting to hear that replicated. But this is where I thought it was important, and what would argue, frankly, for having a treadmill next door to every psychologist or psychiatrist's office or something like that, right? People who were gaming felt fatigued. They felt exhausted afterwards. They felt depleted ultimately. They were in a worse mood generally when they were done gaming. Some of that might be because they were spending hours and hours and hours doing it compared to the amount of time that people were exercising. But even still, this was ultimately. Even if in the moment that they were doing it, they were receiving a benefit, there was a depletion aspect for them when they were done. The exercisers, however, felt an increase in cognitive clarity and energy. They were more open and interested in what was going on. So you can imagine that they were sort of their brains were turning into these sponges. They were ready to absorb and to really think and to work on, what is something that I could do to begin to think about things in a different way, or how could I change my behavior in a way that is more positive, and that they had more of the energy to do it. You couple these things with a decreasing anxiety, better well-being, and feeling less negative symptom, and that this is a state that we really ought to be capturing for people, because it's unclear how long that lasts for after the exercise is done. And so we're in the process of really thinking about how can we actually do sort of a CBTPX, as we're calling it, but sort of exercise enhanced CBTP. And I think that this it'll be interesting to see what we can do with that, because again, we should be thinking clinically about the overall health of folks, and exercise certainly is part of that. But if we can get a 2-for-1, so to speak, then all the better. I wanted to mention just some of the things that Kate Hardy in particular is doing around community engagement. She's done a number of different trainings around the country, really, including here. And so this is certainly something we'll be actively working on. Especially interesting to work with. It's one thing to imagine CBT for folks who are the earlier stages of illness. Maybe their symptoms aren't as, let's say, as concrete, but to really think about how can we use some of those same ideas in state hospitals and in prisons and things, and in jail, where where people may have ended up down a different path than they otherwise could have, and so they're going to get their mental health care through the criminal justice system, which has obviously a lot of ramifications for how likelihood of continuing and what that means, but also for people who are such significant, what can we do for people who have such significant symptoms that they are ultimately staying in state hospitals, or who have forensic overlay to what's going on? So some of the future plans then within the Inspire Clinic, I wanted to at least start out by mentioning publicly, so that we're all accountable for it, that we want to have a community day with UCSF. We've been talking about that, to be able to help. Several years ago we had Pat McGorry came to visit, who's one of the kind of fathers of early psychosis work, and we had an excellent day planned, and it was really intended for providers, and that was great, and it was really motivating to get off the ground. We did that together actually here, and but it's time to do something also for the community at large. There's a lot of people with questions. We may not be able to answer them all, but it's nice to give people an opportunity to understand sort of where we stand on a lot of things. interestingly, there was the recent International Early Psychosis Association meeting, which was in Boston last month. Kate Hardy and Steve Adelsheim led the first actual sort of early psychosis conference to take place, dedicated early psychosis clinical conference to take place in the U.S. There were about 300 attendees for a one-day pre-meeting. It was really tremendous to hear what came out of that, and the feedback has been that there's continued desire. Politically, there's SAMHSA has set aside money in various block grants, in the block grant for states to work on prevention services, and so there's a lot of people out there who are trying to understand, well, what should we actually be doing? How should we be developing teams? How should we be involving peers in our work? And so this is something that to be on the lookout. I think they're looking at targeting doing this on an annual basis going forward, and I would recommend that folks who are interested in early psychosis work attend. The other thing that I'm really excited about, and that really came in large part from the recent IEPA meeting, but it's something we've been talking about for a long time, is how to really figure out how best to involve peers and other key stakeholders in our decision making, both clinically and in terms of research. And so we are starting out what we're going to call the Credit Bureau, which is again one of our acronyms that we like to use, but where all research studies and really all of our investigator-initiated work is going to be a topic of discussion amongst a group that is to be comprised of majority patients and family members. We will be on there too for discussion, and to make sure that we are aiming our research, in a direction that is interesting to the people who are, the recipients of the findings in large part, and not that it's that there will be binding decisions as a result of it, but that at least we're making sure that we're being sensitive, that we're thinking things through, and really taking the suggestions of the community. And so that we are just about to get started with that, and also important that from a philosophical perspective, that the folks who are on that committee will be compensated financially for their time, so we make sure that we're avoiding anything like tokenism or other things like that, that people recognize that we're interested in their expertise and their experience as a way of guiding things and giving us feedback and information we wouldn't otherwise be able to get on our own. And so that will be something that we plan on starting early in 2019. Similarly, we're putting together also a clinical panel to again think about, well, what are some of the services we should be offering, and can we get better clarity from a stakeholder group as far as we have ideas of what we'd like to expand to, more supported employment education. That may require certain philanthropy in order to accomplish some of that in our system, and so how can we utilize our community to think about, is that where we should be targeting our efforts in terms of cultivating resources, and maybe they have the ability to help with that to some extent as well, but nonetheless, to make sure that we're staying on target with things. And then lastly is that I started actually now recently as the medical director of our inpatient unit, and so trying to really use work on the inpatient unit to tie in directly with outpatient to make for more seamless transition for folks, ultimately to help decrease the duration of untreated psychosis, which again is another whole topic in and of itself, but to see what we can do to make sure that people are coming into the hospital, when they are coming in with the first episode, that there's sort of instant recognition of what's going on, and how can we make sure that we're bringing in a lot of the Inspired Clinic ideals to the inpatient unit, which can easily get into being a place that is much more paternalistic than we would typically be. So we want to make sure we're imbuing to the extent that we can, aspects of shared decision making, and other things to help in the psychoeducation to make sure that patients and families understand immediately what they're up against, but also what is available for them. And so trying to bring in other inpatient attendings who will also work with us in the clinic, and to think about how we can tighten the connection between those places. So I'll finish off with this was the back of the napkin drawing that I kind of made before getting started with the Inspired Clinic. This is pretty good. We're gonna involve we're gonna be their patient-centered medical home. We'll liaise with medicine, neuroscience studying, public health, nutrition, psychiatry. That seems to be pretty reasonable, right? That should be sufficient. Of course, it wasn't long before I realized that this is really what it was. And actually, this slide is even a few years old, and I imagine that if I was to really think about it, and also get better at making things smaller, we could fit in many more spokes on this, that early psychosis in particular touches all aspects of a person's life and also all aspects of the mental health and healthcare system, and also is heavily involved with community efforts. And so the number of stakeholders and people who touch our clinic continues to expand. Now, just for a couple of final plugs. One of them is PepNet. PepNet is the Prodrome and Early Psychosis Network. It's housed at Stanford, but it's a national network funded by SAMHSA and others. And it's a place, first of all, that there's newsletters and a listserv that I would encourage everybody to sign up for. There certainly are a number of webinars and other things that are advertised through that listserv that can be of general interest, especially for trainees in particular. And so I would encourage people to sign up if there's any interest in early psychosis. But also, one of the things that PepNet does, and actually now SAMHSA just published also, is a comprehensive list of early psychosis centers. And so I know that we get a number of Stanford students as patients, and it's tricky to balance, well, where are they going to go after they leave the hospital, or if they have to go back home for a little while, how can we make sure that they're getting the appropriate interdisciplinary type of care, the CSC model, as it's sometimes referred to, of care. And so to look on PepNet to see where are these clinics, as they're popping up all the time. And so it's certainly helpful for referral sources and the like. So I encourage people to join that. And then this is what our website looks like. And we have some FAQ on there too that may be of interest to people. You're welcome to use those. That was a residency project. So these questions and answers were tested through many focus groups with patients and family members and other folks who are interested. And so I encourage you to look at some of those. I encourage you to spend less time looking at our non-ever updated list of people who are part of the clinic, although that's, many of them are still with us, but not everybody. And then this is the snapshot of the team. And with that, I'm happy to open it up for a discussion. Yes.
I'm going to ask you to comment further on longitudinal studies. And the reason is, as you know, but our trainees are here, is because in the issue of prodrome, there's difficulty in diagnosis. There's also the question of preventing worsening and how to assess that by observer rating and by self-report.
Yeah. So, right, these are the sort of age-old and huge obstacle questions. First off, so if we're thinking in the prodrome, if the argument is that schizophrenia is already a heterogeneous syndrome that may comprise itself of a number of different pathways that lead to something that we can generally agree people have or don't have, although again we can get into the fidelity of diagnosis even as well too as being a challenge. But the prodrome is clearly going to be even more heterogeneous. If only 25 to 30% or so of people who are brought into prodrome type clinics or high-risk clinics end up developing what we consider to be schizophrenia, we're talking about heavily diluted samples. And so I think that that it is true that is a tough group to really research. Now, I think obviously, right, Naples, to me, is one of the best ways to go about that, which is, all right, let's collect large samples. Let's collect all this data before people have a diagnosis, and at least if we have a large enough sample, we'll see some people who end up having the diagnosis, and what can we learn from those folks that's different, and what can we learn about what can we do to go back and see before they had medication as well, and were there markers that start to stand out? But again, I mean, I think that the challenge is going to be, and the reason why I'm interested in some of these 40 to 50,000 sample type of studies, or 100,000 samples in some of the GWAS studies and things, and being able to bring that together with pharmaceutical records. We have one person on our team who has access to millions of patients worth of pharmaceutical records and other healthcare records. Is that the heterogeneity is going to be such that without using what I think these large data abilities, we're not going to be able to really separate out different pathways very well. And I think that we're going to end up, as we have, which is a lot of averaging. And well, people with schizophrenia do X. People with schizophrenia have this biomarker, and that's true, I think, for some people with schizophrenia, right? It's not that it's not true, but I don't know that you could then go backwards and say if you have that biomarker, right, you're going to be more that you have schizophrenia, and that's where it gets to be really, really tricky. And so I think that my hope is that maybe by having incredibly large samples and being able to really use some of the complex computer science and artificial intelligence approaches that I know basically nothing about, that maybe that's where we'll start to at least be able to parse some of those differences out a little better. Damien?
So I'm intrigued by the pancreas story.
Yeah.
Can you you said they were D2 receptors in the pancreas. Are those the same D2 receptors?
Yeah.
So we're tracking.
And so,
Exactly the same way.
same enough for my purposes, which is to say, yeah, I think they are.
Bound by it.
Yep, and potent D2 antagonists, Haldol and others, bind to them and very robustly and very immediately release insulin. And I can't draw the whole pathway as to how it gets there, but certainly it's notable, and certainly in mice it's incredibly quick, and in the dish. I mean, it's a little harder to ascertain in humans, but there's certainly something there to be concerned about, especially if we're thinking about, so fine, people with schizophrenia or antipsychotic induced metabolic disorder might have like type 1 or type 2 type phenotypes for developing diabetes, but it may correlate or not correlate with abdominal obesity or weight gain, which again, I think is another way of looking at the heterogeneity of that people are all reacting to these medicines in slightly different ways. But that if you are blocking or if you are releasing insulin in the absence of glucose as a stimulant, then you are making that insulin more resistant, ultimately needing to produce more of it, ultimately leading to some burnout. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about the Ballon study.
Sure.
And I think he said that the insulin resistance is not dose dependent.
Right.
And so I was intrigued by are you going to be able to see results in 6 weeks?
I hope. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, we are limited by the fact that it's a small pilot study and with a tiny department-funded budget and things, and so trying to, and most of what we're really interested in this small study is, can we see even a slight change, but also is it safe and people really tolerating it, and is this something that we could do on a broader basis for a longer term? Looking back at literature from 25 plus years ago that says it's safe is great, but it'd be nice to get a little bit more first-hand experience, and then we can apply for a larger grant that might give us a little more time, because we're not going to see, certainly not going to see changes in A1C in 6 weeks. We're not going to see any changes in weight in 6 weeks. So maybe we'll see a change in insulin resistance markers like a HOMA-IR, a slight change. I don't even, based on even the numbers that we have in that study, I'm not sure we'll see a statistically significant difference. But can we at least see a trend that might encourage us to do something further?
And I guess the assumption is that the changes are reversible when you stop.
I mean, that would be the assumption. I mean, again, I don't know, but we'll see what happens with folks. And it is interesting that the other dopamine agonist, cabergoline, also has shown some of this impact on positive impact on these metabolic markers, and so, but also it's tricky with bromocriptine and cabergoline. We talk about these as dopamine agonists, right? But they are dirty drugs, and they do a lot, and they hit a lot of other targets. So again, it's hard to precisely pinpoint. It's hard to find a pure dopamine agonist to try, at least in that's especially one that's already FDA approved and clinically available. So a little bit of this is trying to use what we have to do our best, at least to get a sense of is this a worthwhile line to pursue further? Sure. Yes.
So the genetics of schizophrenia is moving extremely quickly. And I'm just wondering how you guys are thinking about integrating that into what you're doing.
Clinically?
Yeah. In terms of research.
Yeah. Well, so I would say
research rather than
right.
clinical at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that. So one of the things that one of the main loci that has come up of interest is around MHC and the complement system. And so I will say that clinically speaking, we have been surveying more of our folks for inflammatory markers, and in particular elevations in complement. We've seen a number of patients actually with elevations in C4A, which has been linked to schizophrenia, which is interesting. It's a tough lab to fully get because it's you got to send it out. It takes a week or so to get it back. It can be very finicky. But it was interesting that in some of our work with Jenny Frankovich in the PANS clinic, she was encouraging us to look at that because that comes up a lot in her PANS patients. And we had a number of people I would say, had atypical presentations of psychosis, and we started ordering it. And at first, I almost thought there was a systematic lab error because like the first 5 people I ordered it in a row all had 2 or 3x normal on C4A, while they had normal C3 and C3A and C4. And so we've been trying to figure out, well, what do we do about that in the short term while we're trying to figure out what that means and all of that. And we've been giving some of those folks celecoxib. We tried giving some of them actually Flonase just to try to get some steroid right up, through the cribriform plate. They liked it for a week or 2, then kind of got annoyed with it. But it's interesting to think about. At least that's certainly one tie-in. And I think that's probably the one that we have a lot of sort of active area of interest right now. Also, in terms of thinking about, well, what can we use from our clinical observation to help guide? It sounds like there's work to do there to better understand that.
So I guess just for the residents and others in the room, I think it's important to note that the C4A allele has almost no individual risk when looked at in isolation. Right, so the increased risk for schizophrenia, if you just have an elevated C4 allele, is about 0.27. So we take you from a 1% risk of having schizophrenia to a 1% risk of having schizophrenia. So I think while it's interesting to look after, I'm not sure that thinking about clinical intervention based upon that alone, or even elevated C4, it's a really, as you said, a difficult lab assay, and be careful about that. But what I do wonder is, one of the things that's happening now in the field, right, is not around individual genes.
Right.
It's around where their real power is in schizophrenia genetics right now is the polygenic risk score.
Absolutely, right.
Which is really limited just to the Caucasian, Northern European population. But if you look at that, the difference between the top decile of risk versus the bottom decile of risk cross-sectionally, it's at least a 20-fold increase in risk. So you're not talking about 0.27 increase in risk looking at a single allele, but 20-fold. So one of the questions I have is that I don't know about what you guys and others are thinking, like in Naples, et cetera. That's cross-sectionally. I don't believe anyone has answered the question. If you look at people with prodrome and 25% are transitioning, what do they look like in terms of polygenic risk score? Is that a useful marker to say that you would think maybe it's a genetically enriched population? In fact, when you look at other things like response to clozapine, Cardiff did a very large study of this, thought absolutely there must be a relationship between needing clozapine and polygenic risk, complete flatline. So I do wonder when you're trying to parse heterogeneity, and you know that you have genetics that parses at least cross-sectional risk, whether or not you guys are thinking about maybe trying to use that to take a look at longitudinal course. May turn out to be nothing, but it's a pretty big predictor of just cross-sectional.
I don't know what's happening within the Naples group. I mean, I hope that they're doing something along those lines. I mean, again, with all of these folks, with data collected and labs and all these things, there's a lot to be able to look at sequentially, and genetics and epigenetics and all these things that can change all the time. It becomes a very complex picture. But yes, I agree. The idea that we're looking for a schizophrenia gene or one gene is absolutely, we're past that. And the polygenic risk score it makes much more sense. But again, it's still not enough to be able to sort of, I'm not going to order an exome sequence or even other sequencing to try to sort of give people a sense in the high risk, say, well, you have this. I'm not ready to do that yet, to tell you have a...
So clinically, I totally get that. I just wonder whether or not, as we think about longitudinal studies or taking a look at this group clinically, it's $25 for a genome array, right?
It's crazy.
So not exome sequencing, which wouldn't give you the data anyway. But for a GWAS chip, it's
nothing.
Almost nothing. And I just think that, this kind of idea that schizophrenia genetics has been largely useless, which, by the way, candidate genes are officially useless. Like there's a genome advisory group that has told NIH we are not, and Josh has adopted this, so any of you in the room, NIH is not funding anything that is based now on candidate genes. But I think that there's this lingering sense that all of that was such kind of crap, if you'll excuse my language, that it really doesn't make sense to think about genotyping a clinical population. But I think the field is moving so fast that, running a $25 chip, even if you're not going to use the data now. Like if Naples turns out to show you that it's critical to understand something about course, et cetera. you might have some really interesting post-hoc analyses.
Yeah,
looking at-
well, especially with as these large biobanks are accumulating as
Yeah.
well. So Stanford has just started a biobank, but we are orders of magnitude behind everybody else. Right? So we have gene pool. It's my hope as they clarify the consent process and whatnot to have everybody in the Inspire clinic ultimately give a sample to gene pool, at least to store it. And that's something that's going to happen, I think, in 2019. I mean, they're supposed to make it much easier to get people consented. Right now, it's a little challenging. But also, Laramie, who's our genetics guru, has a lot of partnerships with a lot of these big biobanks. And I think that's where we're going to work with her. Yeah.
Geneticist?
Yes, I can.
That became my favorite. Thank you.
I knew it ahead of time.